On the 28th of November 2025, something happened that barely showed up in the headlines. China, widely reported as the world's third largest silver producer, appears to have started tightening silver export licenses. No official announcement, no press release, just export applications quietly getting rejected, and that's the part that grabbed me. Because this looks exactly like the same script China used with rare earth elements and gallium, and in both cases, prices didn't simply climb, they surged. Some rare earth categories jumped by roughly 400%. Gallium tripled in less than 6 months. Now, it seems they're doing something similar with silver. Silver itself hit 5,932 on the 6th of December 2025. So I keep coming back to one question. Is this restriction the reason? What does China see that the wider market isn't pricing in? My view is that this isn't really about trade policy. It's about strategic positioning, and if history even partially rhymes, we could be watching the opening phase of a supply squeeze that reshapes the silver market. Here's what I've put together. I've tracked China's commodity strategy for years, and there's a pattern, a consistent, repeatable pattern whenever they decide a material has strategic importance. It typically unfolds in 4 stages, and from what I'm seeing right now, silver may have just moved into stage 3. Let me explain. Stage 1 is integration and dependency. This is when China produces the commodity, exports it openly, and the West gradually becomes heavily reliant on Chinese supply. Everyone benefits. Prices remain low. Supply chains stay smooth and no one pays much attention, especially in silver. That's essentially been the status quo for decades. Based on mining figures, China produces around 3,700 metric tons of silver per year. That's about 119 million ounces, placing it as the third largest producer globally after Mexico and Peru. But here's the key detail. China isn't only mining silver, it's refining it. Various reports suggest Chinese refineries handle roughly 20-25% of global silver supply, including imported concentrates from other countries. Meaning even silver mined elsewhere often ends up being processed through China. That's how dependency forms. Western manufacturers, especially in electronics and solar, lean on China not just for supply, but for refining capacity too. That's stage 1, completed. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, and I'm not connected to anyone mentioned in this video. This is strictly educational analysis using publicly available information. Stage 2 is what I call quiet accumulation. This is when China reduces exports, but most people don't notice because it's obscured through different channels. Domestic demand is said to rise. Industrial usage increases. Strategic stockpiles may be built, and even then, prices can stay muted because paper markets and Western inventories still appear functional. For silver, I believe we've been in stage 2 for the last 3 to 5 years. Here's why. Customs-related figures suggest China's silver imports have climbed sharply through 2024 and into 2025. Some reports indicate China imported more than 5,000 metric tons of silver in 2024, roughly 160 million ounces. But exports? Those have been trending downward, steadily, over time. Industry watchers have pointed out that China's silver exports have fallen sharply, compared with 2020 and 2021 levels. So where is that silver going? In my view, it's being stockpiled. China doesn't publish strategic reserve figures for silver the way it does for oil or grains, but the direction of the data suggests steady accumulation. And the motive is straightforward. They're positioning for demand that's already accelerating. Solar manufacturing is the first clue. China dominates the global solar supply chain, and many reports place its share of worldwide solar panel production at around 80%. Every panel relies on silver paste for conductivity, and there's no practical substitute at scale. Then there's electric vehicles. China is not only the largest EV market, it's also the largest EV manufacturer. EVs can use 2 to 3 times more silver than traditional cars. If China is ramping production, it makes sense they'd want to lock in supply. And here's the real leverage point. If you control the silver, you influence the industries that depend on it. Solar, EVs, electronics, much of the West's green transition roadmap runs through silver. If exports tighten, the West doesn't just face higher prices, it faces a supply problem. Stage 3 is restriction and weaponization. This is where export licenses start getting denied. Publicly, the language is usually environmental protection or domestic supply priorities. But functionally, it's strategic leverage, and based on what I'm seeing, we're entering that phase right now. On the 28th of November 2025, according to the industry sources I've been monitoring, Chinese silver export licenses began to face quiet rejections, not universally selectively. Some buyers report delays, others say they've been denied outright. There's no obvious pattern except that it's happening now, and it wouldn't be new behavior. China didn't lead with a loud announcement on rare earths either. Restrictions showed up first, and the official story followed later. Same with gallium. By the time it was formally stated, the market had already begun repricing the risk. The sequence is consistent. Quiet tightening first, policy clarity later. By then, supply is already constrained. Now look at the timing against silver's price action. On the 6th of December 2025, silver hit 5,932 seconds. That's up from roughly 302 at the start of 2025, about an 85% gain year to date. Is the export restriction part of that move? I believe it is. To understand why, you have to look at the rare earth blueprint because it's the model everyone should remember. In 2010, China produced roughly 95% of global rare earth elements. These materials are critical for magnets, batteries, defense systems, and wind turbines. The West was deeply dependent, then China began tightening exports. The explanation was environmental regulation. The justification was domestic demand. Within 18 months, market data showed rare earth prices jumping anywhere from 300% to 750%, depending on the element. Neodymium, used in magnets, went from around 50 per kilogram to over $400. Dysprosium rose to roughly 2,000, 500 per kilogram from under 200. Western manufacturers panicked. Defense contractors struggled to source materials. The U.S. The government launched emergency efforts to restart domestic rare earth mining, and even then, it took years. China held control of the market through the entire cycle. Gallium followed the same logic, but on a faster timeline. In July 2023, China announced export controls on gallium and germanium, both crucial for semiconductors and military technology. Within 6 months, reports suggested gallium prices had tripled, and Western chipmakers began dealing with supply pressure, and the key detail is the same as always. China is estimated to produce around 80% of the world's gallium. When China restricts exports, there's often no quick replacement. The West scrambles and prices can move violently. That's why late November 2025 feels different with silver and arguably more dangerous. China may only produce about 13% of global mine supply by some industry estimates, but it refines roughly 20-25% of global silver. And unlike rare earths or gallium, silver isn't just a tech input. It's monetary. It's an investment metal. It's industrial. Demand comes from multiple directions at once. If supply tightens, every sector ends up competing for the same ounces. Investors chase it, manufacturers need it, and no visible stockpile is large enough to comfortably absorb a long, sustained shortage. Silver at $59 may only be the opening chapter. What worries me most is the timing. Why would export tightening show up in late November 2025? In my view, it connects directly to the green energy transition and to geopolitical leverage. The U.S. and Europe have committed trillions toward decarbonization. Solar expansion, EV adoption, grid upgrades, storage buildouts. All of it requires silver. The International Energy Agency projects solar capacity could triple by 2030, which implies a major jump in silver demand, potentially hundreds of millions of ounces over time. If China constrains supply, Western energy targets become harder or even impossible to meet on schedule. That's leverage, economic, political, and strategic. And there's a deeper lesson here. The West sanctioned Russia, froze reserves, and leaned hard on dollar-based power. China watched that happen and likely concluded something simple. You can't sanction what you don't control, but you can control what your competitors can't function without. If Western solar supply chains depend on China's silver refining or exports, then China effectively gains a veto over the pace of Western energy policy. That kind of influence can be worth far more than export revenue. With silver already near $59 and climbing, it's possible that this strategy is moving from theory into practice. Stage 4 is price dislocation and crisis. That's when the shortage becomes impossible to ignore. Prices spike sharply, alternatives get explored, but replacement solutions take years, and by the time they arrive, the market has already repriced. Are we already in stage 4? I'm not certain, but we're close. Silver at 5,932 is signaling that something is changing. If restrictions continue, here's how I think the next sequence unfolds. First wave, premiums jump further. Right now, based on dealer chatter, physical silver premiums for coins are around $5 to $8 over spot, with some reports even higher. If Chinese supply tightens more, industrial buyers will start bidding aggressively for physical metal, not just paper exposure. Premiums could push to $15, $20, even $25 over spot. From my perspective, the stress is already visible. Second wave, paper market strain intensifies. COMEX futures pricing assumes that deliverable supply exists when contracts need to settle. If a meaningful slice of global refining capacity is restricted or redirected, that assumption gets tested. More backwardation events where spot prices exceed futures could appear, and that's typically a loud signal that the physical market is getting tight. If the shortage persists for months into 2026, silver could gap higher from today's $59 level quickly, not gradually. Think $75, $90, $100 an ounce or more. Not as a slow grind, but as a sudden repricing. Because eventually, industrial users don't have the luxury of waiting. They need silver to keep production lines running. When they need the metal, they'll pay whatever it takes. And when industrial demand collides with investment demand in a real shortage, price discovery can get violent. Let me lay out a few scenarios from today's $59 level, and to be crystal clear, these are speculative projections. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm showing what could happen if historical patterns repeat. Conservative scenario. China tightens exports but stops short of a full ban. Supply gets moderately tighter. Premiums rise. Silver moves from $59 to roughly $70, $75 over the next 3 to 6 months as the market reprices and alternative supply routes begin to form. That's about 18% to 27% upside from here. Moderate scenario. China meaningfully restricts exports for strategic reasons. Western refiners can't plug the gap quickly. Industrial users compete for limited physical supply. Silver pushes to $90, $110 within 12 months. That's roughly 52% to 86% above current levels. Aggressive scenario. China effectively shuts down silver exports, similar in spirit to the rare earth play. A true supply crunch develops. Solar and EV manufacturers start facing production bottlenecks. Governments step in, strategic stockpiles get tapped, but they don't bridge the gap. Silver could spike to $150 or higher as panic hits. That's 150% plus from around $59. Which one happens? I don't know. But I do know this playbook has shown up before and it has worked for China every time. And silver is already up about 85% in 2025. Maybe the market is starting to sniff it out. Here's the convergence I'm watching right now. China restricting silver exports in late November 2025. That's new and it matters. Silver hitting 5,932 on December 6th. That's an 85% year-to-date gain. A continuing global silver supply deficit, the Silver Institute has reported multiple consecutive deficit years. Industrial demand, accelerating solar installations, EV output, data center build-out all rising, while COMEX inventories are under pressure. Reports suggest registered silver is around 113 million ounces or less. Geopolitical tension rising U.S. China relations strained, Taiwan concerns, trade war rhetoric. Then the Federal Reserve meeting on December 9-10, 2025, with a rate cut expected, which could weaken the dollar further. All of this is happening at the same time. That isn't coincidence, that's convergence, and convergence creates volatility. One more thing I'm tracking closely, dealer premiums and delivery times. If these export restrictions are real and tightening, the physical market should reflect it first and more clearly. I'm checking dealer sites daily. Right now, many are showing 2 to 4 week delivery windows for common products, sometimes longer. Premiums are already elevated about $5 to $8 over spot for many items, with some dealers higher. If that stretches to 6, 8, 10 weeks in the months ahead, that's a signal. If premiums start jumping above $15 an ounce for generic rounds, that's a signal. If refiners begin announcing allocation systems or purchase limits, that's a signal. The paper price says $59, but the physical market doesn't lie, and if premiums hit $20, you're paying $79 for silver that futures pricing claims costs $59. That's a two-tier market. That's what a crisis looks like. Now let's talk risks, because this isn't one-sided. What could break this thesis? First, I could be wrong about the restrictions. It's possible the export license denials are just isolated cases, not a coordinated policy shift. Maybe this isn't China running the rare earth playbook on silver at all. That's absolutely on the table. But silver sitting at $59 and the timing still makes me uneasy. Second, supply could respond faster than I'm assuming. Mexico and Peru might lift output. Refining capacity outside China could expand sooner than expected. Recycling could help close the gap. If the market can rebalance within 6 months, the price impact could end up being smaller than this thesis implies, even from the current $59 level. Third, substitution could move quicker than expected. Maybe copper or aluminum becomes workable in certain use cases. Maybe new manufacturing methods reduce silver loading in solar panels. That's more of a long-term pressure valve than a near-term fix, but it's still a real risk to watch. Fourth, demand could break down. If a global recession hits, solar installations and EV sales could slow sharply. Industrial consumption would weaken, and that could cap prices even if supply tightens. Given the broader economic backdrop and already elevated silver prices, this is a genuine 2026 risk. Fifth, geopolitics could cool off. If U.S.-China relations improve, trade friction eases, and restrictions get relaxed or reversed. It's possible. I'm not building my base case around it, but it can't be ruled out. So here's what I'm monitoring over the next 3 to 6 months. First, official policy signals from Beijing. If silver is formally added to restricted export frameworks, that's meaningful confirmation. Second, physical premiums and delivery times, because this is the canary in the coal mine. Third, COMEX inventory levels. If registered silver drops under 100 million ounces, that's a major threshold in my view. Fourth, industrial buyer behavior. If big solar or electronics manufacturers start flagging silver-related supply issues or cost pressures, that would validate the core idea. And finally, price action, because the tape often reveals the truth before press releases do. Silver is at $59 right now. If it clears $60 and starts driving towards $70 on rising volume, the market is effectively pricing in serious supply stress. The other variable is whether new supply can come online. If Western miners announce accelerated output plans or new refining capacity, that could soften the impact, but those moves take time. One final point. Even if China doesn't fully clamp down on exports, even if this plays out more slowly than the rare earth example, the strategic message still matters. China is signaling to the world that it can shape critical commodity supply chains. It did it with rare earths, it did it with gallium, and now it's doing it with silver. That shifts the whole playing field. Western governments will react strategic stockpiles, incentives for domestic mining, refinery expansion, but none of that happens overnight. It takes years. In the meantime, supply is tight, demand is still rising, and silver is already at $59. In that environment, price becomes the main mechanism that forces balance. That's why I think the silver setup is so compelling right now. Not because of one single catalyst, but because multiple forces are pointing the same way. Potential Chinese restrictions, ongoing supply deficits, accelerating industrial demand, geopolitical pressure, currency debasement in silver already up roughly 85% in 2025. When those factors converge, markets don't always move smoothly. They gap, they spike, they catch people off guard, and maybe that process has already started. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm sharing what I'm seeing. China has used this playbook before and it worked. If they're applying it again, silver at $59 becomes a very different story. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next, or whether you'll be looking back in 6 months wishing you'd taken it seriously. If you want to follow this as it develops, subscribe. I'll be tracking Chinese policy signals, dealer premiums, COMEX inventories, everything in real time. Do you think China is running the rare earth play on silver? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear what you think. This could end up being one of the biggest commodity stories heading into 2026.